I found my snowblower chained to a stake in front of the HOA office, with a bright orange violation tag flapping in the February wind. And my first thought was that someone had made a colossal mistake. My name is Xavier Thornton, and I have lived in Meadowbrook Estates in Naperville, Illinois for 6 years now. The subdivision sits on the western edge of town, about 45 minutes from Chicago on a good day. It is one of those planned communities with identical vinyl-sided houses, manicured lawns even in winter, and strict rules about everything from mailbox colors to the exact shade of beige you can paint your shutters. I bought my house here because it was affordable and close to my job as a maintenance supervisor at a local manufacturing plant. The HOA seemed like a minor inconvenience back then, just another part of suburban life. That morning in early February was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze when you breathe. We had gotten 14 inches of snow overnight, and I had woken up at 4:30 in the morning like I always did after a heavy snowfall. Not because I enjoyed the cold or had some weird love of snow removal, but because I had a responsibility. For the past 3 years, I had been clearing the driveway at Fire Station 47, which sat just outside our subdivision on Route 59. The station housed 2 engines, 1 ladder truck and a small ambulance, and it served not just Meadowbrook Estates but 4 other neighborhoods in the area. When the driveway got buried in snow, response time suffered. People could die. The arrangement had started almost by accident. I had been out clearing my own driveway one morning after a massive storm, when I noticed the fire station across the street struggling with their own snow removal. Their ancient plow truck had broken down, and 3 firefighters were out there with shovels, trying to clear enough space to get the engines out. I had a commercial-grade Toro snowblower, a beast of a machine I had bought used from a landscaping company. It could chew through 2 feet of snow like it was nothing, so I drove over and offered to help. Captain Mike Reynolds, who ran the station, had been grateful. We got the whole driveway cleared in under an hour. He offered to pay me, but I refused. My dad had been a volunteer firefighter in Michigan where I grew up, and I knew how tight budgets were for small stations. Instead, Mike and I worked out an informal agreement. Whenever we got significant snowfall, I would clear their driveway first thing in the morning before I left for work. In exchange, they kept an eye on my house when I traveled, and Mike occasionally helped me with household projects that required an extra set of hands. It was a good arrangement. Everyone benefited. The station got reliable snow removal. I got peace of mind knowing my house was being watched, and the community got faster emergency response times during winter storms. I had cleared that driveway probably 40 times over the past 3 years, always before 6 in the morning, always without fanfare. But apparently, someone had decided my snowblower was too loud. I stood there in my driveway, staring at the chain and padlock securing my equipment. The violation notice was printed on official HOA letterhead with the Meadowbrook Estates logo at the top. It read, "Violation of Community Ordinance 14.7 excessive noise during quiet hours. Your gasoline-powered snow removal equipment exceeds acceptable decibel levels and has been operated during prohibited hours multiple times between January 15 and February 8. Equipment has been impounded pending review by the HOA board. A hearing is scheduled for February 20. Failure to appear will result in additional fines and possible legal action. Signed, Helen Cartwright, HOA President." Helen Cartwright. Of course. Helen had moved into Meadowbrook Estates about 18 months ago into one of the larger homes on Oakmont Drive. She was probably in her late 40s, with severely cut blonde hair that she kept in a bob, and she wore the kind of athleisure outfits that cost more than my monthly car payment. Within 6 months of moving in, she had gotten herself elected HOA president by showing up to every single board meeting and overwhelming the other residents with her sheer persistence. Most people in the neighborhood just wanted to live their lives without drama, so when Helen volunteered to take charge, everyone was relieved to let her do it. That relief had not lasted long. Helen ran the HOA like it was a Fortune 500 company and she was the CEO. She instituted new rules, increased dues, and began sending out violation notices for the smallest infractions. Got your trash can out 6 hours early before pickup. That was a $50 fine. Christmas lights still up on January 2nd. Another fine. She patrolled the neighborhood in her white BMW SUV, taking photos and notes, building cases against her neighbors like some kind of suburban prosecutor. I had managed to avoid her attention until now, mostly by keeping my head down and following the rules. My house was painted in approved colors, my lawn was neat, and I made sure to bring my trash cans in within 2 hours of pickup. But apparently, clearing snow at 5 in the morning had finally put me on her radar. I pulled out my phone and called Mike Reynolds at the fire station. "Xavier, hey," Mike answered on the second ring. He sounded tired. "You coming by this morning? We need the driveway cleared before shift change at 7. "That's why I'm calling," I said. "The HOA just seized my snowblower, says it's too loud. I've got it chained up in front of their office with a violation notice." There was a long pause. "You're kidding." I wish I was. "How are we supposed to get the driveway cleared? We've got that broken plow truck sitting in the shop and it's going to be at least another week before it's fixed. We've got 3 inches of ice under all this fresh snow from yesterday." "I don't know, Mike. I'm going to try to sort this out, but I can't make any promises. This is insane. Do you want me to come talk to them? Explain the situation?" "Let me try first. If that doesn't work, yeah, we might need you to get involved." I hung up and stared at the HOA office, which was really just the basement of Helen Cartwright's house. She had converted it into an official office space, complete with a sign and business hours posted on the door. The lights were already on even though it was barely 5:30 in the morning. Apparently, Helen was an early riser too. I walked across the street, my boots crunching in the fresh snow. The subdivision was quiet except for the distant rumble of the highway and the occasional scrape of a shovel, as other early risers worked on their driveways. The sun had not come up yet, and the streetlights cast everything in a harsh orange glow. I knocked on the door of Helen's house. After a moment, she opened it, already fully dressed in black yoga pants and a crisp white sweater. She looked me up and down with an expression that suggested she had been expecting me. "Mr. Thornton," she said, "I assume you saw the violation notice." "I did, and I need my snowblower back." "I have responsibilities." "So do I. My responsibility is to maintain the quality of life in this community, and that includes enforcing our noise ordinances. You've been operating gasoline-powered equipment before 6 in the morning, which is clearly prohibited by our bylaws." "I'm clearing the fire station driveway. You know, the one that responds to emergencies in this neighborhood. When you called 911 last year because you thought someone was breaking into your garage, those were the guys who showed up." Helen's expression did not change. "That's very civic-minded of you, but it doesn't give you the right to violate community rules. There are electric snow removal options that are much quieter, or you could simply wait until 6 o'clock to begin your work. Electric snow blowers can't handle the kind of snow we get here. And if I wait until 6, the morning shift at the station can't get the trucks out for emergencies. You're potentially putting lives at risk over a noise complaint. I'm enforcing the rules that every resident agreed to when they purchased property here. Rules exist for a reason, Mr. Thornton. If we let one person break them, then everyone will think they can do whatever they want. I took a deep breath, trying to control my temper. Getting angry was not going to help. Who complained about the noise? That's confidential. Was it you? Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. The source of the complaint is irrelevant. A violation occurred and I took appropriate action. It was you, wasn't it? You're the only person awake at 5 in the morning besides me. Mr. Thornton, your hearing is scheduled for February 20th. You can make your case to the board at that time. Until then, your equipment will remain impounded. If you attempt to remove it without authorization, I will call the police and have you charged with theft of HOA property. It's my property, which you used in violation of community ordinances, giving the HOA the legal right to impound it until the matter is resolved. It's all spelled out in the bylaws, Section 22, subsection C. I suggest you review them before your hearing. She closed the door before I could respond. I stood there on her porch for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. Then I pulled out my phone and took several photos of my snowblower chained up in front of the HOA office, making sure to capture the violation notice clearly. If this was going to turn into a legal battle, I wanted documentation. By the time I got back to my house, the sun was starting to come up. I called Mike Reynolds again and explained the situation. He was not happy, but there was not much either of us could do at the moment. The fire station would have to rely on manual snow removal until they could figure something else out. Mike said he would talk to the fire chief about potentially getting involved, but these things took time, and time was something we did not have much of. I went to work that day in a foul mood. My job at the manufacturing plant usually kept me busy enough that I did not think about personal problems, but I kept checking my phone, reading and rereading that violation notice, getting angrier each time. By lunch, I had decided to fight back. I started by digging out my copy of the HOA bylaws, a thick binder of documents I had been given when I bought the house and had not looked at since. I spent my lunch break in my truck reading through Section 22, subsection C, which covered noise violations. Helen was technically correct that gasoline-powered equipment was prohibited before 6 in the morning, but there were exceptions carved out for emergency situations and essential services. I was not sure if snow removal for a fire station qualified, but it seemed like a reasonable argument. More importantly, I discovered that the HOA did not actually have the legal authority to seize property without a proper hearing first. They could fine me, they could put a lien on my house, but they could not just take my stuff. Helen had overstepped her authority, probably banking on the fact that most residents would not know the rules well enough to challenge her. After work, I drove to the fire station and found Captain Reynolds in his office, filling out paperwork. He looked up when I knocked on his door. "Xavier, come in. We got the driveway cleared, but it took 6 guys 2 hours. We had to delay a training session because half the crew was exhausted from shoveling. I think I can get my snowblower back, but I'm going to need your help." I explained what I had found in the bylaws, and Mike listened carefully, nodding along. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "So she's basically holding your property hostage illegally. That's what it looks like to me, but I need documentation that what I'm doing is actually essential. If I can prove that me clearing your driveway is tied to emergency services, I think I can argue that the noise ordinance doesn't apply. I can do better than that. I can get you a letter from the fire chief stating that your assistance is critical to our operation." We can also pull response time data showing how much faster we get trucks out when the driveway is already clear. Would that help? That would help a lot. Mike made a phone call right then and there, explaining the situation to Fire Chief Robert Brennan, who oversaw all fire operations in our part of Naperville. The chief apparently had some choice words about HOAs interfering with emergency services, and he promised to have a letter drafted by the next morning. I left the fire station feeling better than I had all day. This was not over yet. That evening, I started making phone calls to my neighbors. I wanted to know if anyone else had been hit with violation notices, and if so, for what. What I discovered was eye-opening. In the past 6 months, Helen Cartwright had issued over 200 violation notices across a neighborhood of 80 houses. Most were for minor infractions, things like trash cans being visible from the street or lawn decorations exceeding the size limit by a few inches. Several residents had been fined multiple times. One family had racked up over $3,000 in fines because their teenage son kept forgetting to bring the trash cans in on time. Nobody was happy, but everyone felt powerless. The HOA had legal mechanisms to collect fines, including putting liens on properties if the fines went unpaid. Most people just paid up and tried to avoid future violations rather than fighting back, but there was a growing undercurrent of resentment. People were tired of Helen's heavy-handed enforcement. They were tired of being watched and documented and fined for trivial mistakes. Several neighbors told me that if I was going to challenge Helen, they would support me however they could. By the time I went to bed that night, I had the beginnings of a plan. This was not just about my snowblower anymore. This was about standing up to a bully who had been terrorizing the neighborhood for months. The next morning, I got up early and drove to the fire station before work. Chief Brennan was there waiting for me with a letter on official fire department letterhead. It was beautifully written, formal and authoritative. It stated that Xavier Thornton had been providing essential snow removal services to Fire Station 47 for 3 years, that these services were critical to maintaining emergency response capabilities during winter weather, and that any interference with these services could potentially endanger public safety. The chief requested that the HOA provide a waiver for any noise ordinances that might apply to this essential work. I thanked the chief profusely and headed straight to Helen Cartwright's house. It was 6:15 in the morning, well within acceptable visiting hours according to the bylaws. I knocked on her door, and this time it took her several minutes to answer. She looked annoyed when she saw me. "Mr. Thornton, the hearing is still 2 weeks away." "I know, but I wanted to give you this." I handed her the letter from the fire chief. She read it slowly, her expression not changing. When she finished, she looked up at me. "This doesn't change anything. The fire department doesn't have jurisdiction over HOA rules. Actually, it changes everything. First, you illegally seized my property without a proper hearing, which violates Section 22, subsection F of our own bylaws. Second, what I'm doing qualifies as an essential service under Section 22, subsection C, paragraph 4, which provides exceptions to noise ordinances for emergency and safety-related work. And third, if you continue to interfere with snow removal at the fire station, you're opening yourself and the HOA up to potential liability if someone dies because emergency vehicles couldn't respond in time." Helen's jaw tightened. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm explaining the legal reality of the situation. I want my snowblower back by the end of the day. If it's not returned, I'm filing a police report for theft and taking you to small claims court for the cost of the equipment plus damages." I'll also be requesting an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss your violation of the bylaws. You can't call an emergency meeting without board approval. Actually, any 5 residents can call an emergency meeting according to Section 3, subsection A. I've already got 7 people signed on. We'll be submitting the request this afternoon. That was a bit of a bluff. I had not actually collected all the signatures yet, but I was confident I could get them. Helen must have seen something in my expression because her own expression shifted slightly. For the first time since I had met her, she looked uncertain. "Fine," she said. "You can have your equipment back, but this isn't over. I'm still pursuing the violation at the scheduled hearing." "That's your right. I'll see you February 20th. She closed the door, and I heard her moving around inside the house. 5 minutes later, she emerged with a key and walked stiffly to the HOA office, where my snowblower was still chained up. She unlocked it without a word and went back inside. I loaded the snowblower into my truck and drove home, feeling triumphant. But the victory was hollow. Helen was not going to let this go, and neither was I. This was just the opening salvo in what was shaping up to be a much larger conflict. Over the next week, I collected signatures from residents who wanted an emergency HOA board meeting. It turned out that getting people to sign was easier than I expected. Everyone had a story about Helen's enforcement tactics, and most people were eager for a chance to push back. Within 3 days, I had 15 signatures, more than enough to trigger the meeting. The current HOA board consisted of Helen as president, along with 4 other members who served as treasurer, secretary, and 2 at-large representatives. The treasurer was a retired accountant named Donald Prout. The secretary was a school teacher named Margaret Hayes, and the 2 at-large representatives were a software engineer named Tim Chen and a nurse named Rebecca Ford. I had met all of them at various neighborhood events over the years, and they all seemed like reasonable people. The problem was that Helen ran the board meetings with an iron fist, and most of the other members just went along with whatever she proposed because it was easier than arguing. The emergency meeting was scheduled for February 15th, 5 days before my violation hearing. It would be held in the community center, a small building near the front entrance of the subdivision that was usually used for neighborhood gatherings and kids' birthday parties. I spent those 5 days preparing. I printed out copies of the fire chief's letter, compiled data on response times from the fire station, and put together a presentation showing all the violation notices Helen had issued in the past 6 months. I also consulted with a lawyer friend of mine, Daniel Reeves, who practiced real estate law in Chicago. He looked over the bylaws and confirmed that Helen had overstepped her authority by seizing my property without a hearing. He also pointed out several other issues with how Helen had been running the HOA, including the fact that she had been issuing fines without board approval, which was technically required for any fine over $50. The night of the emergency meeting, the community center was packed. I had expected maybe 20 or 30 people, but at least 60 residents showed up, which was more than half the neighborhood. Folding chairs filled the main room and people lined the walls. There was an energy in the air, a mixture of anger and anticipation. People were ready for change. Helen sat at a table at the front of the room with the other board members, looking calm and composed. She called the meeting to order at exactly 7 o'clock. This emergency meeting was requested by several residents to discuss concerns about HOA operations, she began. We'll start by hearing from Xavier Thornton, who submitted the request. I stood up and walked to the front of the room, my hands full of papers. I had practiced what I was going to say, but now that I was standing in front of everyone, my mouth felt dry. "Thanks for coming, everyone," I began. I requested this meeting because I think we have a serious problem with how our HOA is being run. 2 weeks ago, HOA President Helen Cartwright seized my snowblower and claimed it was being operated in violation of noise ordinances. What she didn't know, or didn't care about, was that I used that snowblower to clear the driveway at Fire Station 47, which serves our neighborhood. I've been doing this for 3 years, and it's essential work. When the fire station can't get their trucks out because of snow, people can die. I distributed copies of the fire chief's letter to the board members and held up my own copy so the audience could see it. This is a letter from Fire Chief Robert Brennan confirming that what I do is essential. Helen's response when I showed her this letter was to say it doesn't matter, that HOA rules are more important than emergency services. But that's not even the worst part. What Helen did was also illegal according to our own bylaws. She seized my property without a proper hearing, which violates Section 22, subsection F. She's been issuing fines without board approval, which violates Section 8, subsection B. And she's been operating with complete disregard for the actual welfare of this community. I pulled out the spreadsheet I had compiled showing all the violation notices from the past 6 months. In the last 6 months, over 200 violations have been issued in a neighborhood of 80 houses. That's an average of more than 1 violation per month for every single household. The total fines assessed exceed $70,000. We're not talking about serious violations. We're talking about trash cans, Christmas lights, and lawn decorations. We're talking about Helen Cartwright treating this neighborhood like her personal fiefdom. There was a murmur of agreement from the audience. I saw people nodding and a few raised hands like they wanted to speak. Helen stood up, her face flushed. "Mr. Thornton, you're out of order. This meeting was called to discuss your specific situation, not to air grievances about HOA operations." "Actually," I said, pulling out my copy of the bylaws. Section 3, subsection A says that an emergency meeting can be called for any matter that affects the welfare of the community. I think systematic overreach by the HOA president qualifies. Donald Prout, the treasurer, cleared his throat. "Xavier has a point, Helen, and I have to say, I'm concerned about some of what he's presenting. I wasn't aware that you'd been issuing fines without bringing them to the board." "Everything I've done has been within my authority as president," Helen said. "The board gave me discretion to enforce violations up to $100. "No, we didn't," Margaret Hayes, the secretary, said quietly. She was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s with graying hair. "The motion we passed said you could issue warning notices, but all fines were supposed to be approved by the board. I have the meeting minutes." Helen's expression tightened. "That's a matter of interpretation." "It's really not," Tim Chen, one of the at-large representatives, said. He was a thin man in his 30s with glasses. "I remember the discussion. We specifically said board approval was required for fines." The room erupted in conversation. People were talking over each other, some directing questions at Helen, others sharing their own stories about violation notices. Helen tried to regain control, but the meeting had gotten away from her. After several minutes of chaos, Rebecca Ford, the other at-large representative, stood up and raised her voice. "Everyone, please, let's maintain order." She was a tall black woman with a commanding presence, and people quieted down when she spoke. "I think we need to take this seriously," Rebecca continued. "If what Xavier is saying is true, and it sounds like it is, then we have a president who's been operating outside her authority. That's a problem. I move that we conduct a full review of all violation notices and fines issued in the past 6 months, and that all enforcement actions be suspended pending the results of that review." "I second that," Donald said immediately. Helen looked like she had been slapped. "You can't do that. We have a responsibility to enforce the bylaws. We also have a responsibility to follow proper procedures," Rebecca said. "All in favor?" 4 hands went up, everyone except Helen. The motion passed. "This is ridiculous," Helen said. "You're undermining the entire purpose of the HOA." "No," Margaret said, and there was steel in her voice that I had not heard before. "We're making sure the HOA serves the community, not the other way around." The rest of the meeting was spent discussing next steps. It was decided that a committee would be formed to review all of Helen's enforcement actions, and that a special election would be held to determine whether she should remain as president. Several residents volunteered to serve on the review committee, and I was asked to chair it since I had done all the initial research. Helen stormed out of the meeting before it officially adjourned, slamming the community center door behind her. Nobody tried to stop her. After the meeting ended, dozens of people came up to thank me. Many shared their own horror stories about Helen's violations. One elderly woman told me she had been fined $200 because her mailbox post had been damaged in a storm, and she had not replaced it quickly enough. A young couple said they had been cited for having children's toys visible in their front yard. The stories went on, each one more petty than the last. I went home that night exhausted but satisfied. We had struck a blow against tyranny, albeit a very suburban, mundane form of tyranny. But I also knew Helen was not going to go quietly. She had too much invested in her role as HOA president, too much of her identity wrapped up in being the person in charge. I was right to be worried. The next morning, I woke up to find that all 4 of my tires had been slashed. My truck was sitting in my driveway, listing to one side, with deep cuts in each tire. I immediately called the police. Officer Marcus Williams arrived within 20 minutes. He was a middle-aged cop with a patient manner and a notebook that he filled with careful notes as I explained the situation. I told him about the HOA conflict, about the meeting the night before, and about Helen Cartwright's reaction. "You think she did this?" he asked. "I don't have proof, but the timing is pretty suspicious. Any security cameras in the neighborhood?" "A few houses have them, but I don't think any would have a view of my driveway." Officer Williams walked around my truck, taking photos. "I'll file a report and we can canvass the neighbors to see if anyone saw anything, but without evidence, there's not much we can do." I spent the rest of the morning dealing with insurance and getting my truck towed to a shop. The tires would cost me $800 to replace, and my truck would be out of commission for at least 2 days. I was angry, but more than that, I was determined. If Helen thought vandalism was going to scare me off, she was wrong. I borrowed a car from my friend Daniel, the lawyer, and spent the next few days working with the review committee. We met at the community center every evening, going through stacks of violation notices. What we found was damning. Helen had been issuing violations for things that were not even in the bylaws. She had been doubling and tripling fines for repeat offenses without any authorization. In several cases, she had issued violations for properties where the supposed infraction did not even exist. One homeowner had been fined for having an unapproved fence color, but the fence in the photos was clearly the approved shade. It appeared Helen had adjusted the photo lighting to make it look different. We compiled everything into a comprehensive report and scheduled another HOA meeting for February 22nd, 2 days after my original violation hearing. The hearing was still on the schedule, but it felt almost beside the point now. The real issue was not my snowblower. It was whether Helen Cartwright should be removed as HOA president. 3 days before my hearing, I got a call from Captain Mike Reynolds at the fire station. His voice was tense. "Xavier, we've got a problem." Helen Cartwright just filed a formal complaint with the city, claiming that the fire station is creating a public nuisance by allowing unauthorized persons to operate loud equipment near residential areas. She's demanding that the city prohibit you from clearing our driveway. You're kidding. I wish. The fire chief is trying to fight it, but she's apparently got some connections on the city council. This could get ugly. I thanked Mike and immediately called Daniel. He listened to the situation and let out a low whistle. She's escalating. That's not a good sign. If she's willing to go after the fire department, she's not thinking clearly. People who feel cornered do desperate things. What can we do? Keep documenting everything. And at this point, you might want to consider filing a restraining order if you believe she's behind the vandalism to your truck. I don't have proof. No, but you have a pattern of harassment. The seized equipment, the retaliation after the meeting, now this complaint to the city. A judge might see that as grounds for a temporary restraining order. I thought about it and decided to wait. A restraining order felt like too much of an escalation, and I did not want to be the one pushing things into legal territory if I could avoid it. I still hoped this could be resolved through the HOA process. The night before my violation hearing, I could not sleep. I kept going over my arguments, checking my documentation, making sure I had not missed anything. At 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went to sit in my living room with a cup of coffee. That was when I saw the headlights. A car pulled up slowly in front of my house and stopped. I recognized the white BMW SUV immediately. Helen Cartwright sat in the driver's seat, just looking at my house. She stayed there for a full 5 minutes, not moving, not getting out, just watching. I grabbed my phone and took a video through the window, making sure to capture the license plate and timestamp. Then I called the police non-emergency number and reported it. By the time a patrol car arrived, Helen was gone, but I sent the video to Officer Williams, adding it to the growing file of concerning behavior. The next morning, February 20th, I arrived at the community center at 6:45 for my 7 o'clock hearing. I was surprised to find that the parking lot was already half full. Apparently, word had gotten around, and people wanted to see how this played out. The hearing was set up formally, with the 5 board members sitting at a table at the front and a single chair facing them where I was supposed to sit. It felt like a trial. Helen sat in the center, with the other board members on either side. Her expression was cold and professional. This hearing is to address the violation issued to Xavier Thornton for operating gasoline-powered equipment during prohibited hours, Helen began. Mr. Thornton, you have 15 minutes to present your case. I stood and walked to the chair, but I did not sit down. Instead, I remained standing and addressed the board. Before we talk about my case, I want to address the fact that this hearing is being conducted by someone who illegally seized my property, who has been operating outside her authority for months, and who is currently under investigation by a committee appointed by this very board. Helen Cartwright should recuse herself from this proceeding. I will not, Helen said. I am the HOA president, and it is my job to oversee enforcement actions. Not when you're the one who issued the violation, Rebecca Ford said. Xavier's right. This is a conflict of interest. I agree, Donald Prout said. Helen, you should step aside and let the rest of us handle this. Helen's face flushed red. Fine, but this is noted for the record as an inappropriate attempt to undermine HOA authority. She stood and moved to a chair at the side of the room, her arms crossed. Rebecca took over as acting chair. Thank you, Helen. Xavier, please present your case. I laid out everything. The fire chief's letter, the response time data, the essential nature of the work, the improper seizure of my equipment, and the exceptions in the bylaws for emergency services. I showed photos of the fire station driveway buried in snow, and I brought printed statements from firefighters describing how critical the snow removal was. The board members listened carefully, asking questions and taking notes. When I finished, Rebecca looked at the other board members. "I don't think we need to deliberate on this. The violation was improperly issued, and even if it hadn't been, the work Mr. Thornton is doing clearly qualifies as essential under our own bylaws. I move to dismiss the violation and expunge it from HOA records." "Second," Margaret said immediately. The vote was unanimous, 4-0, with Helen abstaining. Just like that, it was over, but Helen was not done. She stood up from her chair, her face twisted with anger. "This is a travesty. You're setting a precedent that anyone can break the rules as long as they claim it's important. This neighborhood is going to fall apart because you're too weak to enforce basic standards." "Helen, that's enough," Rebecca said. "The hearing is concluded." "No, it's not. You all need to understand what's happening here. Xavier Thornton is not some hero. He's a troublemaker who has been undermining me from the start. He organized a coup against my leadership. He's turned the neighborhood against me, and now you're rewarding him for it." "Helen, please sit down," Donald said. "I will not sit down. I have given everything to this community. I have spent countless hours enforcing rules, maintaining standards, and making sure this neighborhood is a place we can be proud of. And this is how you repay me. By siding with someone who thinks he's above the rules. You illegally seized his property," Tim Chen said. "You issued hundreds of violations without board approval. You've been harassing residents for months. This isn't about Xavier. This is about you abusing your authority." Helen's expression changed. For a moment, she looked genuinely confused, like she could not understand how anyone could see her actions as wrong. Then her face hardened. "If that's how you feel, then you can run this HOA without me. I resign." She grabbed her bag and walked toward the door. But before she left, she turned back to face me. "This isn't over, Xavier. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've started." She left, and the room fell into stunned silence. Rebecca was the first to speak. "Well, that was dramatic." A few people in the audience laughed nervously. The tension broke, and everyone started talking at once. The board members huddled together, discussing what to do next. Eventually, Rebecca stood and addressed the room. "Given Helen's resignation, we're going to need to hold an election for a new HOA president. In the meantime, I'll serve as acting president. Our next regular meeting is scheduled for March 1st, and we'll have a special election at that time. Thank you all for coming." People started filing out of the community center, many stopping to congratulate me or share their relief that Helen was gone. I accepted the congratulations, but I felt uneasy. Helen's parting words had sounded like a threat, and I did not think she was done causing trouble. I was right. 2 days later, on February 22nd, I received a certified letter from a law firm in Chicago. Helen Cartwright was suing me personally for defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She was seeking $50,000 in damages. The lawsuit was clearly retaliatory and probably would not hold up in court, but it would still cost me time and money to defend against. I immediately forwarded it to Daniel, who read through it and shook his head. "This is garbage, but you're going to need to respond. I can handle it for you, but it's going to take a few months to get dismissed. How much is this going to cost me? If she pushes it all the way, could be a few thousand in legal fees. But I think she's going to drop it once she realizes it's not going anywhere. This is about intimidation, not actually winning." The lawsuit cast a shadow over everything. Even though I knew it was baseless, It was stressful having it hanging over my head. I tried to focus on other things, like continuing to clear the fire station driveway and working on the HOA review committee. But it was hard not to worry. The committee's final report came out on March 1st, the same day as the special election for HOA president. The report was damning. It documented over 300 improper violations, $75,000 in fines that had been assessed without board approval, and multiple instances of Helen altering evidence to support violations. The report recommended that all fines issued during Helen's tenure be reviewed individually, and that residents be given the opportunity to appeal any violations they believed were improper. The special election was held that evening. Rebecca Ford ran for president, and she won in a landslide. One of her first acts was to issue a public apology on behalf of the HOA to all residents who had been unfairly targeted during Helen's tenure. She also announced that the HOA would be implementing new oversight procedures to prevent any future president from abusing their authority. For a few weeks, things seemed to calm down. The lawsuit was still pending, but Daniel assured me it was proceeding exactly as expected, which meant slowly and without much action from Helen's lawyers. Spring was coming, the snow was melting, and life in Meadowbrook Estates was returning to something resembling normal. Then, on March 18th, I came home from work to find my house had been broken into. The damage was extensive. Furniture was overturned, dishes were smashed, and someone had spray-painted obscenities on my living room wall. But nothing was stolen. Not my TV, not my laptop, not even the cash I kept in a drawer in my bedroom. This was not a burglary. This was vandalism, pure and simple. I called the police, and this time, Officer Williams brought a detective with him, a woman named Detective Sarah Morrison. She was in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She walked through my house, taking photos and notes. "You said you're having a dispute with your former HOA president," she asked. "Yes. She sued me a few weeks ago. Tell me about that." I explained everything, from the snowblower seizure to the lawsuit. Detective Morrison listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Has she made any direct threats?" "Nothing explicit, but she said this isn't over when she resigned, and she drove by my house in the middle of the night a few weeks ago. I have video." "I'd like to see that video, and I want to talk to this Helen Cartwright. Do you have her address?" I gave her Helen's address and sent her the video from my phone. Detective Morrison thanked me and said she would be in touch. Over the next few days, I learned that the police had interviewed Helen, who denied any involvement in the break-in. She claimed she had been at a yoga class at the time, and she had witnesses to confirm it. The police checked her alibi, and it held up. She had been at the yoga studio when my house was broken into, but Detective Morrison was not satisfied. She started looking into Helen's associations, her friends, her family. What she found was interesting. Helen had a younger brother named Connor Cartwright who lived in Chicago and had a criminal record. Nothing major, mostly petty theft and one assault charge that had been pleaded down to a misdemeanor, but it showed he was capable of breaking the law. Detective Morrison brought Connor in for questioning. At first, Connor denied everything. But when the detective showed him evidence that his phone had been pinging off cell towers near Meadowbrook Estates on the day of the break-in, his story changed. He admitted that his sister had asked him to scare me, and that he had broken into my house while she was establishing an alibi at her yoga class. He had not expected the police to trace it back to him. Connor was arrested and charged with burglary and criminal trespass. Helen was arrested as an accessory and charged with conspiracy to commit burglary. Both were released on bail, but the charges were serious. Helen was facing up to 5 years in prison if convicted. The story made the local news. Former HOA president arrested in revenge plot. Read the headline in the Naperville Sun. The article detailed the entire saga, from the snowblower seizure to the break-in, and it painted Helen as an unhinged tyrant who had gone too far. The publicity was embarrassing for everyone involved. Meadowbrook Estates became known as that neighborhood with the crazy HOA lady, and property values took a temporary hit. But it also brought the community together. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before started having conversations about how to prevent this from happening again. The HOA board implemented sweeping reforms, including term limits for board members, mandatory oversight for all enforcement actions, and regular audits of HOA finances. Helen's lawsuit against me was quietly dropped a few weeks later. Her lawyer probably realized that suing someone while facing criminal charges for harassing them was not a good look. The criminal trial took place in late May. I was called as a witness, and I spent half a day on the stand describing the events leading up to the break-in. Connor Cartwright had already pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, and he testified against his sister, describing how she had manipulated him into committing the crime. Helen's defense was that she had never intended for anyone to actually break into my house, that she had just been venting to her brother and he had taken it too far. But the prosecution had text messages between Helen and Connor that told a different story. In one message, Helen had written, "He needs to understand what it feels like to have his property violated." In another, she had sent Connor my address and told him when I would be at work. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Helen was found guilty of conspiracy to commit burglary and sentenced to 18 months in prison, with the possibility of parole after 9 months. She was also ordered to pay restitution for the damage to my house, which totaled nearly $12,000. As the sentence was read, Helen sat motionless in the courtroom, her face blank. Whatever she had thought would happen when she started this campaign against me, I doubted it had included prison time. But she had escalated again and again until she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. After the trial, I tried to put the whole mess behind me. Summer came, and with it, easier weather and no need for snow removal. I continued to maintain the fire station's lawn during the growing season, using a push mower that was much quieter than my snowblower. Captain Mike Reynolds and I remained friends, and he continued to look after my house when I traveled. The new HOA board under Rebecca Ford's leadership was a vast improvement. Violations were issued sparingly and only for legitimate concerns, like actual safety hazards or egregious violations of reasonable standards. The neighborhood felt lighter, less oppressed. People decorated for holidays without fear, left their trash cans out a few extra hours without anxiety, and generally lived their lives without constant surveillance. In August, I received a check in the mail from Helen Cartwright for the full $12,000 in restitution. It had been paid through her lawyer, and there was no note or message attached. I deposited the check and used some of the money to upgrade my security system and repair the damage that insurance had not covered. The rest I donated to the fire station's equipment fund. Helen was released on parole in February, having served 9 months of her sentence. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved to Arizona to live with her sister and had no plans to return to Illinois. Meadowbrook Estates had been sold, and a nice retired couple had bought her house. They were quiet, friendly, and showed no interest in joining the HOA board. As winter came around again, I found myself back to my early morning routine, clearing the fire station driveway with my snowblower. The sound of the engine in the pre-dawn darkness had become comforting, a reminder that I was doing something useful, something that mattered. And nobody complained about the noise. On a cold morning in late February, almost exactly a year after Helen had seized my snowblower, I was finishing up the fire station driveway when Captain Reynolds came out with 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one, and we stood together in the early morning light, watching the sun come up over the frozen landscape. "You know, I never properly thanked you for sticking with us through all that craziness," Mike said. "You don't need to thank me. This is what neighbors do." Not all neighbors. Most people would have just given up and let us deal with our own snow removal. But you fought for what was right, even when it cost you. I shrugged. "I'm stubborn. Ask anyone." Mike laughed. "Stubborn and reliable, that's a good combination." We drank our coffee in comfortable silence, and then I loaded my snowblower back into my truck and headed home. The neighborhood was starting to wake up, lights coming on in windows, people heading out to scrape ice off their windshields and start their days. It looked like any other suburban morning, peaceful and ordinary, but I knew better now. I knew that peace and ordinary were not things you could take for granted. They had to be protected, sometimes fought for, against people who would abuse their power and make everyone else's lives miserable in the name of rules and standards and order. The fight had been exhausting and expensive and stressful, but it had also been necessary. And as I pulled into my driveway and looked at my house, with its slightly crooked mailbox and the small garden gnome that technically violated HOA guidelines about lawn decorations, but that nobody cared about anymore, I felt satisfied. Helen Cartwright had tried to rule our neighborhood through fear and intimidation. She had tried to make herself important by making everyone else feel small, and in the end, it had destroyed her. Not because of anything I had done, but because you cannot build a community on a foundation of resentment and control. Eventually, people pushed back. The snowblower incident had been the spark, but the real issue had always been bigger than noise ordinances or early morning hours. It had been about whether a homeowners association existed to serve the residents or to serve the ego of whoever happened to be in charge. And our neighborhood had answered that question decisively. Life in Meadowbrook Estates was not perfect after Helen left. There were still disputes, still violations, still the occasional conflict between neighbors. But they were handled with common sense and proportionality, and there was no longer the constant anxiety that had permeated the neighborhood during Helen's reign. Rebecca Ford proved to be an excellent HOA president. She was firm but fair, and she understood that the goal was not to catch people making mistakes, but to help maintain a pleasant community where everyone could live comfortably. Under her leadership, the HOA became something helpful rather than oppressive. The fire station continued to be grateful for my help with snow removal, and Chief Brennan sent a formal commendation to the HOA board, praising the community for supporting emergency services. It was framed and hung in the community center, a reminder that sometimes the right thing to do is more important than following rules blindly. As for me, I went back to my quiet life. I worked at the manufacturing plant. I cleared snow when it fell. I mowed the fire station lawn in summer, and I tried to be a good neighbor. The whole experience had taught me something important about standing up for yourself and others, about not letting bullies win through intimidation, and about the importance of community standards that actually serve the community. Sometimes, when I was out early in the morning with my snowblower, I would think about Helen Cartwright sitting in her prison cell, probably still convinced that she had been right and everyone else had been wrong. I did not feel particularly triumphant about her fate. Prison was a harsh outcome for what had started as overzealous enforcement of HOA rules. But she had made her choices, each one escalating the conflict until she had crossed into criminal behavior. I had not put her in prison. She had put herself there. The seasons turned. Spring brought rain and new growth. Summer brought heat and cookouts in backyards. Fall brought falling leaves and the smell of wood smoke. And winter brought snow, which I cleared from the fire station driveway in the early morning darkness, my snowblower's engine cutting through the quiet, doing work that mattered, helping people I cared about, living the life I had chosen in the community I had fought for. One afternoon in late March, I was working in my garage when a car pulled up in my driveway. I did not recognize the vehicle, a silver sedan with rental car plates. A woman got out, probably in her late 50s, with the same blonde hair as Helen Cartwright but softer features and a kinder expression. "Xavier Thornton," she asked. "That's me. My name is Patricia Morrison. I'm Helen's older sister. You have a few minutes to talk." I hesitated, then nodded and invited her to sit on my front porch. We sat in the wooden chairs I had built a few summers ago, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "I wanted to apologize," Patricia finally said, "for what my sister put you through. I know it doesn't change anything, but I felt like someone from our family should acknowledge what she did was wrong. You don't need to apologize for her actions. I know. But I also think you should understand that Helen wasn't always like this. She used to be kind, generous. But after her divorce 5 years ago, something changed. She became obsessed with control, with being in charge, with proving she was important. Moving here and becoming HOA president fed into that obsession. I tried to talk to her about it, but she wouldn't listen. "I appreciate you telling me this, but I'm not sure what you want me to say." Patricia smiled sadly. "Nothing. I don't want anything. I just wanted you to know that the person who hurt you wasn't the real Helen. She lost herself somewhere along the way. Maybe, but she still made her choices. And people got hurt because of them. You're right. I'm not trying to excuse what she did. I just wanted to offer some context." We talked for a few more minutes and then Patricia left. I watched her car disappear down the street and I thought about what she had said. Maybe Helen had not always been the tyrant I had known. Maybe she had been someone different once, someone better. But it did not change the reality of what she had done, the pain she had caused, the damage she had inflicted on an entire community, because she could not let go of her need for power. That evening I went for a walk around the neighborhood. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Children were playing in yards and I could hear laughter and the distant sound of a basketball bouncing. It was peaceful, ordinary, good. I walked past the community center, where a sign announced an upcoming neighborhood barbecue. I walked past the playground, where a group of teenagers were hanging out and talking. I walked past houses where people were cooking dinner, watching TV, living their lives without fear of violation notices or arbitrary fines. This was what I had fought for. Not for myself, though that had been part of it, but for this. For a community where people could live freely, where rules existed to help rather than oppress, where someone in power could not terrorize everyone else just because they had a gavel and a spreadsheet of violations. When I got back to my house, I sat on my porch and called Daniel, my lawyer friend who had helped me through the whole ordeal. "Xavier, hey, how are you doing?" "Good. I just wanted to say thank you again for everything you did. I know I already said it, but it's worth repeating." "You don't need to thank me. What you did took real courage. Standing up to someone who has power over you, even small power like an HOA president, that's not easy. Most people just go along to avoid conflict." "Yeah, well, I'm stubborn," Daniel laughed. "That you are. But it's a good kind of stubborn. The the kind that makes things better. We talked for a while longer, and after I hung up, I sat there in the growing darkness, thinking about everything that had happened. The snowblower seizure had been the catalyst, but the real story had been about a community finding its voice, about people coming together to reject tyranny in whatever form it took, even if that form was just an overzealous HOA president. In the end, justice had been served. Helen was facing the consequences of her actions. The neighborhood had been reformed, and I had learned that sometimes standing up for what is right means accepting conflict and uncertainty and risk. But it is worth it. It is always worth it. As I sat there, I heard the distant sound of a siren. A fire truck from Station 47 heading out to an emergency. The driveway I had cleared that morning had let them respond quickly, and somewhere, someone was getting the help they needed because of it. That was what mattered. That was why I had fought so hard. I went inside, made dinner, and settled in for the evening. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to be a good neighbor and a good person. But tonight I was content. The battle was over, the community was healing, and life was moving forward. The snowblower sat in my garage, ready for the next storm. And I was ready too, knowing that whatever came next I would handle it. Because that is what you do. You show up, you do the work, you stand up for what is right, and you help the people around you. It is simple, really. Not easy, but simple. And as winter slowly gave way to spring, and the snow melted and the days grew longer, Meadowbrook Estates became the community it had always been meant to be. A place where people could live their lives, raise their families, and know that their neighbors had their backs. That was the real victory, not the legal rulings or the criminal convictions, but the restoration of a community that had been broken and was now whole again. I continued to clear the fire station driveway every time it snowed, and I continued to be a part of the neighborhood that had become more than just a place I lived. It was home, truly home, and I had fought for it. That was something to be proud of. That was something worth remembering. And every time I heard that snowblower's engine roar to life in the early morning darkness, I was reminded that even small acts of service, done consistently and with purpose, can make all the difference in the world.